Today we'll be talking about preparing for the coming prophecies. We're going to find ourselves on the timeline presently, which is important, and that's the prophetic information we need to know, to heed, to prepare for. There's two marquee events. I look at them as bookends on God's timeline. These are powerful events. One was the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, which is when God's hourglass made its final spin in the end times. Now the grains of sand are coming through down to the very bottom of that hourglass. The next one we're going to race to is when God puts the world on official notice that He's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who sent Jesus Christ to die for our sins. And He's going to do that in what's called the Gog of Magog invasion in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And that event is drawing very, very near. So look at these as bookends. Yes, things certainly happen after the Magog invasion, but my concern is, where are we at right now between these two events on the timeline? The significance of Israel in a nutshell, there's all kinds of prophecies. Some that I'll be sharing with today, you'll see how significant Israel was. Unfortunately, the world and the church at large thinks that the existence of Israel today is merely the fulfillment, the moral obligation of the United Nations after the Holocaust. They don't see God's conspicuous fingerprints all over the nation of Israel. They ignore the plethora of prophecies that exist. Here is one that's very important to recognize. Jeremiah 23, verses 7 through 8, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that they shall no longer say, As the Lord lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up and led the descendants of the house of Israel from the north country and from all the countries where I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land." So let's just think about that for a minute. The Hebrews were always supposed to memorialize that exodus out of Egypt. After 400 years of bondage under pharaohs in Egypt, Moses led them out. You know the story. You've seen the Cecil B. DeMille movie of the Ten Commandments. That was a big deal, folks. God brings the Hebrews right to the Red Sea, and He parts the Red Seas. The Hebrews go through. Pharaoh's army comes after them, and the waters converge on Pharaoh's army. That was a big miracle. And the Hebrews were to remember that's how God delivered them, and whenever they faced other giant circumstances in their national history, they would be able to remember how God delivered them through that event. But He's saying that the event that we're seeing right now, that we're in the midst of, is going to be even a bigger event. So let's look at that. God had to implant Zionism on the hearts of the Jews who had been dispersed out into the nations of the world for almost 2,000 years in different cultures, different languages, and put it on their hearts to go back into a land that was desolate and really made no sense. That's one thing He had to do, and He's done it, and He's still doing it, as many Jews still continue to make aliyah over into Israel. He had to create Arab homelands after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, who had reigned over the Middle East for 400 years up until 1917. They were defeated in World War I. There would be no Jewish state if the Ottoman Empire still controlled the area, at which point the Arab states got their existence as we know them. Egypt, I think it was 1922, Saudi Arabia, 1935, Iraq, I believe, Syria, 1946, I believe. He had to prevent the Nazi genocide, or there would be no Jews going to Israel. Hitler wanted to kill them all. He was targeting 11 million in Europe. He got to 6 million. He was trying to get into England to get more. He had to empower the Allied forces to prevent that. He had to create the Jewish state, which was legislated in 1947. And they became a nation in 1948. He had to empower the Israeli army to preserve the existence after the Arabs in 48, 67, and 73. And He has to preserve and prosper them, because we're going to see where they exist in Ezekiel 38 in a condition of great prosperity. And that's where we're just about at right now on the timeline. So this is why this is a big deal, folks. This is why they are to now remember that the parting of the Red Seas pales in comparison to what's going on presently with what God's doing in Israel. So where are we on the timeline? Well, we're 67 years past the rebirth of the nation of Israel, and I believe we are racing toward this event where God will uphold His holy name before the nations of the world. We're told in Ezekiel 38, which is a major prophecy, 52 verses, Ezekiel 38 and 39, very descriptive. It tells us it happens in the latter years. It tells us who's involved, the belligerents. It tells us how they'll be defeated. It tells us what will happen in the aftermath of their defeat, how these invaders will be destroyed by God with fire, hailstone, brimstone. It won't be America. It won't be the Israeli Defense Forces. It will be God. It will be clear that it's God that stops this most massive, armed, and dangerous Mideast invasion of all time. And God is going, and I believe it is so descriptive because God wants to understand this prophecy is a significant prophecy of the end times. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a biblical scholar to read these verses if you have not read them, to walk away with something and understand this prophecy. And I think God intended it for that purpose because he's going to uphold his holy name there through this prophecy in the aftermath of that defeat. But this prophecy is very near for a plethora of reasons that I could tell you. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. Iran is in Ezekiel 38. I'll be showing a map in a moment. Russia and Iran. Russia's in Ezekiel 38. They tend to be the lead player. They spearhead this confederacy. They and Russia have the strongest national relationships in all their history. Turkey is involved. They don't like Israel anymore either. They've contracted with Russia to build a nuclear power plant as well in Ankara around 2020 that will exist. There's many, many other reasons. And Iran, of course, is racing to get a nuclear weapon for the purposes, in part, probably to destroy the nation of Israel. But I've got a question mark up there. What has got to happen before Ezekiel 38 can happen? Because we've got a description of an Israel that exists in Ezekiel 38 that does not exist just yet. The Israel of today is not fully in existence as described by Ezekiel, and unless it is, this prophecy cannot find its fulfillment until it is. So what is in that question mark, and how powerful are these events? But let's talk about why Ezekiel 38 and 39 is at my bookend here, why it's so significant. God says, after he defeats them with fire, hailstone, and brimstone, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them profane my holy name anymore. Then the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. He's going to let the world know that he keeps his promises. He made unconditional covenant with Abraham, that he would be, his name would be made great, that he would, through him, the families of the earth would be blessed. And we realize that was through his seed, the Messiah. It was a messianic prophecy. It was God's plan of redemption. He made an unconditional covenant with him. And integral components within the Abrahamic covenant are the existence of descendants forever, the chosen people, the Israelis, and a promised land for them, which God gave to Abraham in Genesis 15:18, which courses from the river of Egypt, probably the Nile, to the river Euphrates, over which courses through Iraq and Syria today. At no point in history have they ever occupied all that land. They occupy some of it now, and I believe they're going to occupy more of it shortly after one of the prophecies I talked to you about here in Psalm 83. But this is a very significant event. God is going to put the world on notice that he's the holy God who sent Jesus to die that he loves them and he sent Jesus to die for their sins. I believe that event is drawing very near, and that event will trump everything else. It doesn't matter what world leaders think, what Obama's trying to put together, and these types of things. This event is coming, folks. The question is how soon, and when will it be Israel be existing in the conditions described. A little bit on Ezekiel 38. The general consensus of who they are by their Old Testament names of Gog, of Magog, of Meshech, and Tubal, and Persia's in there. Of course, that would be Iran. But you see the list of who most of the Bible scholars believe they are. You've got Russia and some of the southern steppes, the breakaway republics of the former Soviet Union, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, Sudan. You see it's a broad base of countries, none of them sharing common borders with the nation of Israel. I call them an outer ring versus an inner circle. You'll see that I call Psalm 83. None of these countries, none of them, have ever been Israel's historic enemies and never went to war with Israel in the past, except some animosity at the time of Esther with Persia. It's interesting. Ezekiel 38 verses 7 through 12 are the very telling verses that give us the description of the Israel that must be in existence for Ezekiel 38 to find its final fulfillment. They must be regathered from the nations in the latter years. This is how we know it's a latter year prophecy, relevant for our time. Brought back from the sword, the persecution, into a land, Israel, which had long been desolate. And we'll put check marks there because that really has been happening over the last 67 years. But what about the other details that are so paramount for us to understand? They must dwell in the midst, the center of the land. They must be a peaceful people dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates, having gold and silver and acquired livestock and goods, a very wealthy nation possessing booty and great plunder, because that's what Russia's coming after. They want to take over Israel's livelihood. They don't necessarily want to obliterate the Jewish state, which would destroy with the very motive of what they're coming after. They want to get the prosperity, and they want to take over Israel and get that. That's the carrot on the string for them. Is Israel dwelling in these conditions, dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates? Well, if you read this prophecy literally, as I do, no, they're not dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates. They've got a 403-mile wall that separates Palestinian terror out from Israel proper. At various points, it's 20 feet high, filled with concrete. Various other points, it's a solid security fence. And it's working, but they're certainly not secure. That's why they've got this wall up there. In fact, the Middle East is the most fenced-in and fortified region in the entire world, and among all countries, the most fenced-in and fortified is the nation of Israel. Here's a map up here. You can see what's already existing and what's being proposed for fencing near and around Israel, but also in the Middle East. You see down by Yemen, Saudi Arabia is proposing to build a huge fence because they're concerned about the Iranian proxies, the Houthis, that are taking over that area and trying to move in and spread Iran's hegemony on even into Saudi Arabia. So you see fences going all along in the Middle East. So Israel is not dwelling without walls, bars, nor gates. Matter of fact, Israel is proposing to build a fence through. They've got one in Lebanon to the north. They've got one down in the Sinai by Egypt. Now they're proposing to build one up through Jordan because they're concerned about ISIS moving into Jordan. I'll be talking about ISIS where they may be in Bible prophecy in just a moment. Is Israel dwelling securely? The Hebrew words are very clear that Ezekiel uses two different times in verse 8 and verse 11. The Hebrew words are yeshav v'tach. And when you look at the biblical precedent for these words, it means dwelling securely, not because they got land for peace deals, but because they have conquered their enemy and now they don't have to worry about their enemy. They've defeated them militarily and now they can dwell securely. So it says they'll be dwelling safely a couple times in Ezekiel 38. Is Israel dwelling securely right now without walls, bars, nor gates? No, they can't. Right? I was just talking to Dr. David Reagan about this at breakfast this morning. As you drive through Israel, there's bomb shelters everywhere you go. And they have, I think, 15 or 30 seconds once they hear the sirens to get into them. They're building another airport because they're concerned the Ben Gurion airport will be a strategic target in a war, in the next war. They're building another one down by the southern area of Israel, down by Eilat. So I think it's quite a stretch to say that Israel is dwelling securely. If they're not dwelling securely, when will they? Well, we don't have to look past Ezekiel to find out. We go back 10 chapters to Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 26, and we find out when they will dwell safely, when they will dwell securely. And here's what Ezekiel says. Israel, thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them, in the sight of the Gentiles, which we are seeing is going on presently, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely, yeshav v'tach, the same Hebrew words. They will build houses and plant vineyards, yes, they will dwell securely, yeshav v'tach. But when? When I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, then they shall know I'm the Lord, their God. Now I ask you, does Israel have belligerents around them that despise Israel? The answer to that question is just in modern history as well as ancient history, yes, they do. They've got Arab enemies that date back from time immemorial that have harbored an ancient hatred. They've coveted the rich contents of the Abrahamic covenant. And they have always come against Israel and contested Israel's existence and rights to the land. Here's a map of who they are today. You've got Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. They happen to be in Psalm 83, an ancient prophecy I'll be talking about. And out from these Arab states, the inner circle that share common borders with Israel, Israel's notorious enemies, the countries that voted against their ever being in Israel in 1947, the countries that came at war against Israel in 1948, repeatedly in 1967 and 1973, the terrorist populations within them, Hezbollah, Hamas, I believe the Palestinians are clearly put in Psalm 83, and now I think you've got to factor in the other growing concern that's burgeoning out of control in the Middle East, and that is ISIS. If they go unchecked, I think you're going to see them involved in a serious war and probably a prophetic war. They could actually be in Psalm 83. So therefore, as we look at our timeline, what is in that gap that's going to allow God to uphold his holy name in the midst of his people Israel that are dwelling securely without walls, bars, nor gates? He's got to get rid of those enemies around them that despise them. And I believe that's what we see pictured in the prophecy of Psalm 83, written 3,000 years ago by Asaph. So we're going to spend a moment and talk about that particular prophecy. That's on my radar screen. Now, personally, I think this is coming very soon. I think it's imminent. I don't think it's the next one. I think the next one is probably the prophecy of Elam, which I talked about last night. Asaph, the psalmist, wrote 12 different psalms. You see them listed up there. He was one of King David's worship leaders, we find out in 1 Chronicles. But more importantly, and relevant to our talk, we find out that he was a prophet. He was called a seer in 2 Chronicles 29:30. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the leaders commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord and the words of David and of Asaph the seer. The Hebrew word is shazah, and it means a beholder of vision, a prophet like Isaiah and Jeremiah. And of his 12 psalms, the most prophetic psalms are Psalm 83 and Psalm 50. Psalm 83 begins with, "Do not keep silent, O God, do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God." You're going to see as I read the next verses, this is a prophecy for our time. And in the very first verse, God is already responding to Asaph's petition. God is not keeping silent. God is getting the information about Psalm 83 out far and wide. I started writing about this in my first book, Israelistine, in 2008, which people like Dr. David Reagan, Hal Lindsey, Chuck Missler, Al Gist, Don McGee, and others started to read and go, wow, we should consider this prophecy as being valid for our time. Since that time, these guys have been teaching it. I've been on a plethora of TV shows, TBN probably a dozen times, reaching out to millions of people, Daystar, Church Channel, etc., getting this prophecy known to people. God is telling people about this prophecy. He is not keeping silent about it, folks. Not everybody agrees with my interpretation, so do your own homework. I've tried to address every objection I've heard in my works out there, but I sincerely am watching this as a legitimate, bona fide prophecy for our time. It goes on, that was a picture of me on TBN, which, by the way, that particular show aired this year with Perry Stone hosting it with Jonathan Kahn, Mark Biltz, and myself. It's been re-aired 6 times since March this year. I don't think that's ever happened in TBN's 40-year history, and it's on pace to be the most watched TBN TV show in that history, and millions of people have watched it on the internet as well. And I'm not saying that to toot my horn. I'm saying that because these are relevant messages that people are very concerned about, and at the top of that list is Psalm 83, which goes on to say, "For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, 'Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more, for they have consulted together with one consent, and they form a confederacy against you.'" So in a nutshell, what we have here is a group that's going to confederate, and they're going to form crafty counsel, a devious plan with the intentions of wiping Israel off of the map. Now, if I would be teaching this prophecy 100 years ago, you guys would be laughing at me, because there was no Israel. But there is an Israel right now. And when you see who's involved in this confederacy, as I showed you on the map, you'll see that this is very real. Matter of fact, some people believe that this prophecy found at least partial fulfillment in 1948, when these very Psalm 83 countries went to war with Israel on the day of its rebirth. So they want to destroy the nation of Israel. But who are they? Well, they're not the people in Ezekiel 38 and 39. You have 10 belligerents listed here by their Old Testament names, and I've highlighted a couple of them here. The tents of Edom listed first, and whenever they're listed in a habitation condition. And whenever you see in a confederacy in the Bible someone listed first, that tends to banner their plight. Like Gog of Magog is listed first, where we would put Russia as the leader of that Ezekiel 38 invasion. But they're also listed in a habitation condition, which biblically the tents of represent either military encampments or, more applicably, I think for us right now, refugee conditions. And I've studied this. I've got a chapter in my book out there called Hutamites, Who Are the Edomites Today? And the Palestinians today, the Palestinian refugees dwelling in tents after 1948, of course now they're not necessarily in tents anymore, 67 years later, have ethnical representation from the Edomites in their ranks. Not all Palestinians are Edomites, but clearly there's a representation in there. And it goes on and talks about these other groups, Ishmaelites, Moab, etc., I'll tell you who they are again on another map in a moment. But I want you to notice at the very end, in verse 8, it says, Assyria also has joined with them, and they have helped the children of Lot, which would be Jordan. So Assyria has joined with them. They're playing an active role to help the children of Lot, Jordan, which, by the way, today, among the Psalm 83 Confederacy, the weakest army would be Jordan. They would need help. They're mainly in existence, Royal Jordanian Army, to maintain the existence of the Hashemite kingdom. They are not an offensive army, to say the least. Lebanon's got a weak army, and they're in Psalm 83, but of course they got Hezbollah with 100,000 missiles there. And Syria's in shambles, and Iraq's kind of in shambles, but they've got ISIS in there that's very powerful as well. So, interesting. Let's look at that a little bit closer, but as far as what they want to do in verse 12, why they want to wipe Israel off the map is because they want to take for themselves the pastures of God, the promised land, for their possession. So in other words, they want another Arab state. Different than Ezekiel 38's motive, which is they want to take the livelihood, the plunder, and the booty. These guys want another Arab state, it appears to be, if it's for our time. So here's who Asaph listed in their ancient names. In 1948, these modern-day equivalents, these Arab states went to war against Israel. The Psalm 83 inner circle, these guys went to war against Israel. They thought they would win. They lost. And it created this terrible situation called the Palestinian refugees, the tents of Edom. Here's a picture of them in 1949 in a refugee camp in southern Jordan. And the Palestinian refugees are in the West Bank. They're in the Gaza under the banner of Hamas. They're all over the Middle East. They're not just stuck in the West Bank. There's several million of them, and they desperately want a better condition. They've been in 67 years of refugee scenario. It's a sad situation, but they're going about what they need to do about it all the wrong ways. So I believe what Asaph would be telling us, if I took the liberty to tell you right now, if he was standing here instead of me, is that when you see the Palestinian refugees, i.e. the tents of Edom, because remember when he taught, when he wrote, there were no Palestinians and there were no Jordanians and there were no Hezbollah, there were the Edomites and the Ammonites, etc. So he had to use the vocabulary of his day, and we've got to figure out who he was talking about if it's a prophecy for our time. So I believe he would say, when you see the Palestinian refugees, then you need to be prepared for this prophecy. And we're seeing them, and we're seeing that these Arabs have been bannering their plight. Here's who they are today, again on a map. They're no longer throwing stones at the Jews, but they're very armed and dangerous. Israel's had to confront Hamas a lot lately. Thousands of missiles have been sent in from the Gaza. Let's talk about ISIS for a moment. When Asaph talks about Assyria in Psalm 83, what Assyria was he talking about? At the time he wrote, 3,000 years ago, Assyria encompassed a good part of northern Syria on a map today and northern Iraq. Now, when Isaiah wrote, 300 years later, between 740 and 701 BC, Assyria had moved in and taken over all the rest of Syria and Damascus. But not so when Asaph wrote. He was talking very specifically about an Assyria that covered what you see up there shaded in yellow, which just happens to be the very territory, the swaths of land that ISIS now controls. Okay? Now, I'm not sure that ISIS is involved as Assyria in Psalm 83, but I'm not going to rule it out. Okay? So here's a map of what they've now controlled over the last couple years, and they've got their eyes on much more land. They want to control the whole Promised Land, the whole Levant, which is basically the Middle East region, the Promised Land. Now, what it said in Psalm 83, verse 8, first of all, they do have their eyes on Jordan. Let's talk about that for a minute. And inside of Jordan, which is one of the last moderate Arab states, supposedly, with King Abdullah, who has come over to America 3 times and met with Obama in the last year and a half, concerned about ISIS and concerned about the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks, because 60 to 70% of the population in his country are Palestinians, and they have terrible civil liberties, and they want their own state, either or. They want improvements in their situation. Inside of Jordan, you have ISIS sympathizers, just like you had ISIS sympathizers inside of Syria and Iraq. And that's why those territories were fairly easy for ISIS to take over. You know, ISIS is presenting an opportunity for the Sunni Muslims to have a dream of an Islamic caliphate over there. And that's why you're seeing certain terrorist groups right now, like Jabhat al-Nusra, an offshoot of the Al-Qaeda in Syria, aligning with them, and Anwar al-Bayat in the Sinai, a Sunni terrorist group, is aligning with ISIS. There's concerns if they go unchecked that more and more of these terrorist organizations that are Sunni will join with ISIS, and they will continue to spread. And they do have their sights on Jordan, and that's why Israel's building a fence around there. They're proposing one. That's why King Abdullah is coming over and pleading with Barack Obama. Now, what does it say in Psalm 83, verse 8? Assyria has joined with the children of Lot, Jordan, and he has helped, and they will help the children of Lot. It's a very proactive role with Ammon and Moab, which is listed in Psalm 83 as the children of Lot, which is modern-day Jordan. Now, if they do take over Jordan, perchance, they would, in theory, have control, de facto control over the Temple Mount, because Jordan has control over that through what's called the Waqf, the W-A-Q-F. Now, I'm not saying Israel's going to let it go that far, but it looks like that's a possibility. And do they want Jerusalem? It's the third holiest site in Islam. Not mentioned once in the Quran, listed by 70 different names over 1,000 times in the Bible, but not listed once in the Quran, but for some reason they want that, they call that the third holiest site between Mecca and Medina. So I'm not going to go through the rest of Psalm 83 other than to say Asaph petitions the Lord to empower the Israeli Defense Forces to defeat them. And we find out that the Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of Bible prophecy today. I point out numerous verses in my book. I'm just going to share a couple of them with you right here. And they exist not to fight Ezekiel 38 and 39 and not to fend off the Armageddon campaign with the Antichrist. They exist today to preserve the existence of the Jewish state and probably to fend off the final Arab-Israeli war of Psalm 83. Ezekiel 37:10 tells us when Ezekiel sees all these dry bones spread out outside of the land of Israel in this vision, we find out that they're going to resurrect as a nation and come back into the land of Israel. It's a picture of restoration into the land of Israel. And he says, in the process, I prophesied, and he commanded, and breath came into them, and they lived, and they stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. And that's exactly what the Hebrew words mean, an exceedingly great army. Ezekiel uses that term several times in his chapters. The prognosis for the Palestinians, the tents of Edom, is very dismal. According to Obadiah 1:18, the house of Jacob shall be a fire. Read that as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. The house of Joseph a flame, the same, an IDF. But the house of Esau, i.e. the Palestinians, shall be stubble, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So if you have any Palestinian friends, tell them to receive Christ now and get out of their terrorizing mindset, of Islamic mindset, because their prognosis is the worst of all. There will be remnants of some of the Psalm 83 countries that make it into the kingdom that actually do come to know Jesus Christ, and many are right now coming to know Jesus Christ in the Middle East. They're disenchanted with Islam. Obadiah goes on to say something very interesting. In verses 19 through 20, and read it yourself, but I'm going to summarize it for you, that Israel will annex territory. He goes on to say they're going to take over southern Jordan, the Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and even Zarephath in southern Lebanon. I sincerely believe that someday the Israeli people will get all the land promised to Abraham from Egypt to the Nile, the Euphrates. But I believe they're going to get some of it incrementally. They'll get it all when Jesus comes, whatever they haven't got. But I believe they're going to get some of it incrementally. I point out the reasons for that. When Israel wins wars, and they're going to win the Psalm 83 war, they expand territorially. They did it in 1967. It increases the defensibility of their borders. They feel justified in taking that land because it's part of the Abrahamic covenant. Joshua did it 3,300 years ago when he won wars. King David did it 3,000 years ago, as did King Solomon when they won wars. So I'm just saying, I'm looking for the atlases of the Middle East to be redrawn again, showing a greater Israel, a Mideast superpower. Matter of fact, the land God gave Abraham, you see it up there in Genesis 15:18, technically, If you look at the size of Israel today, which is about the size of New Jersey, about 8,000 to 9,000 square miles, you could technically fit in, that's where Israel is today, you could technically fit in a whole lot more Israels in this land. You could actually fit in at least 36 Israels into this territory, as best we can understand the description of it. Someday they will have that, and someday they might have more of that real soon. Just saying. I get into a lot of details and research, over 8 years of research in these books, out there on my table. Psalm 83. Let's move on to the next one. Well, here in a summary, just as we close out on Psalm 83, basically it says, you see the belligerents on the right side of the screen. Their motive is they want to destroy the nation of Israel, that the name of Israel can be remembered no more. And what do they want to do? They want to take for themselves the pastures of God. If it's for our time, they don't want peace with the Jews, they want peace without the Jews. They don't want a two-state solution, they want a one-state solution, and they want to fly the flag of Palestine over it. And isn't that really what's going on? And there's going to be more pressure coming up for peace talks for the Jews to give up land. It's all culminating and coming to a head. And remember, what's driving it all, that will trump everything, is that God's about ready to uphold His holy name. It doesn't matter what all these gyrations are geopolitically. Isaiah 17. I think it could be related somehow to Psalm 83. Isaiah 17, the destruction of Damascus. I believe that's going to happen before Ezekiel 38 and 39, as do, I believe, Psalm 83 will. Matter of fact, Isaiah 17 might precipitate Psalm 83. What is Isaiah 17? Well, there's quite a bit written about Damascus in Jeremiah 49 and in Amos chapter 1, but we're going to look at Isaiah 17, 3 verses, and summarize it real quickly. Isaiah 17:1 says, the burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. And in the Hebrew, it will be reduced to rubble. It will exist no more. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city in recorded history, dating back to the time of Abraham. And it is the capital of Syria, and it is in shambles right now due to the Syrian revolution. Some people believe this prophecy is finding fulfillment now as Syria, as Damascus comes apart brick by brick. But I tell them, read further, because it isn't the revolution that's going on in Syria that seems to be the cause of the destruction of Damascus. Verse 9 tells us, in that day his strong cities will be as a forsaken bough and an uppermost branch, which they have left because of the children of Israel. And there will be desolation, not only in Damascus, but in other cities. It looks like the Israeli Defense Forces, in self-defense, as you read the entire prophecy, they're not an aggressor, but in self-defense, they take out Damascus. Some people think this was fulfilled in 732 BC by the Assyrian Empire. But I tell those advocates that Isaiah talks about Assyria 37 times in his 66 chapters, but never once mentions Assyria in Isaiah 17, the telling prophecy. But he does talk about Israel being responsible for the desolation. And where it gets real-time application as the prophecy concludes in verse 14, then behold, at eventime trouble, and before the morning he, referring to Damascus in the masculine pronoun, is no more. Damascus, you'll see it one night, and in the morning it will not be there. And the technologies to destroy a city are had by Israel now. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but basically, as I understand it, when it's a nuclear weapon, it's all about the burst altitude. If you want to launch an EMP, you launch it 180 miles and detonate it up, and it spreads out like a canopy at the speed of light and fries everything electronic underneath it. If you launch a nuclear weapon tactically at 45 miles above a city, you can take out the city, and the explosion comes down, but it doesn't suck up all the dirt particles, which Israel has to be concerned with. Damascus isn't very far from Tel Aviv, and they can neutralize the radioactive effects. When the Hiroshima bomb hit, it hit down toward ground level and sucked up all the dirt and everything into the mushroom cloud. So, again, I'm not an expert on that, but I do believe Israel could take out a city overnight. And if there's a major war with Hezbollah lobbing 1,500 missiles a day into Israel, which is a very likely scenario in the next war, Israel will have to fight a prison rules fight, and they will have to pull out their best weapons, and Damascus is a strategic target. It goes on to say, this is the portion of those who plunder us and those who rob us, meaning It's retaliatory. In other words, they are trying to hurt Israel. In response, they get hurt. I talked about this last night. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I think this could be the next prophecy, vastly overlooked in Jeremiah chapter 49. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I've got a book and a DVD out there on this. Basically, when you look at Iran's future, you've got to look at two prophecies, one in Ezekiel 38 and one in Jeremiah 49. And I compare these prophecies. I don't believe they're one and the same. I believe it's dealing with Iran's nuclear program. God is fiercely angry in this prophecy. He's fiercely angry with Iran. He's fiercely angry with them. I believe right now, I believe this prophecy is for our time because they've got bad leadership, because he says he's going to destroy from there the kings and the princes. Why? Because they want to launch something deadly somewhere, which they do want to do. They want to take Israel off the map. God cannot allow that to happen. He's going to uphold his holy name through an Israel that Iran wants to wipe out. When you look at a map, just quickly for those of you that weren't here, Elam is that area shaded up there that hugs the Persian Gulf, and Persia is the rest of Iran, you see reflected by the green arrow. And there's a nuclear facility that's a strategic target to be struck that could create a nuclear disaster quite easily in that area. It's called the Bushehr nuclear reactor. If you want to read more about that, you can pick up my book out there and we'll get into it. Nuclear Showdown. The decline of the great nation of America. It's on my radar, folks. Hal Lindsey would teach, because the revived Roman Empire has to happen, and we believe this is probably happening, although it's kind of a mess over there with the EU, the European Union. But it appears clear from the book of Daniel and elsewhere that the Roman Empire will revive. And therefore, the theory would be America must decline down from its superpower status as that prophecy finds its fulfillment, which we believe is starting to converge, some of us, and start to happen. I'm going to look at some biblical, archaeological, and geopolitical reasons why I think that is happening now, why I think that we actually are in Bible prophecy, where we are. And I believe we're in Ezekiel 38, the prophecy that I've been talking about. Not fighting with Russia. You know, there's 9 populations listed there. And then there's Israel, the victim. But they're not the only participants listed in this prophecy. Goes on to talk about in verse 13, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions, who will say, have you come, Russia, to take plunder and gather your army to take booty, to carry away silver, gold, take away livestock, goods, and great plunder. This is, again, how we know the motive of Russia and their cohorts is not to take the pastures of God for a possession, but to take the livelihood, the prosperity of Israel. Who are these guys? Not fighting with Russia, not protecting Israel. There seem to be protesters. Sheba and Dedan. Sheba would be Yemen. Dedan would be Saudi Arabia. Some people believe they also go over into the Gulf Cooperative Council states that I talked about last night, that's on the other side of the Persian Gulf, the Arab states. But who are the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions? There's theories on that. 2 predominant theories of who Tarshish is and their young lions. One of the theories is that Tarshish is Spain, and that the colonies that came out of Spain, mainly the Latino areas, South America, etc., would be their young lions. Now, I invite you to read the arguments on that. I've spent a lot of time reading them. I think that's a very weak one and easy to refute that one. The other argument, which I favor, the other view, is that Tarshish is the UK, the British Isle, and that, of course, we know America came out of there as the young lions. I'm going to give you a few reasons why I believe this is the case. Some archaeologists believe that Tarshish is the ancient name of Britain, and Tarshish represented what was beyond the Gibraltar, where Italy comes down at one end and Morocco on the other, at the tip of the Strait of Gibraltar, at the Mediterranean Sea, where it reaches out to the Atlantic. As I give you more information on that, just remember this, that we're talking about the merchants of Tarshish, not the athletes, the entertainers, the soldiers, the politicians, the merchants. Whoever these guys are, they seem to be interested in having a commercial relationship, and the Hebrew words are dealing with traffickers, commerce, and things like that Ezekiel uses as merchants. They are seeking to have commerce with this Israel, and they're watching Russia come in a very empowered situation, wanting to deprive Israel of that livelihood and thus the commerce that they hope to have. J.R. Church, a prophecy expert who has passed away, founded Prophecy in the News, wrote in his book Guardians of the Grail, an inscription discovered in 1780 on a cliff above Mount Hope Bay in Bristol, Rhode Island, contained an engraving that read, "Voyagers from Tarshish, this stone proclaims," believed to be inscribed around 533 BC. Harvard University has found 5 locations within the United States where the merchants of Tarshish have had colonies. So it's interesting, they've already found remnants of Tarshish in America. What does the Bible say about Tarshish? Who are they? Tarshish is listed many times in the Bible. We can get a good description of them and their location. As the sons of Javan, one of them was Tarshish. And we find out that these were the ones who settled in the isles of the Gentiles. They divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue and their families. The isles. There's a picture there of the British Isles, which are oversized islands. Maybe a representation there. The theme of the isles and Tarshish being related to the isles and coming from the isles shows up 4 different verses in the Bible. You see them up there in Psalms and in the book of Isaiah. So the argument of Spain kind of loses a little brevity here because Spain is not an island per se, or the Isles. Where is Tarshish? Well, we get a description from the book of Jonah. Remember, Jonah was said to go tell Assyria, to go tell Nineveh that they were going to be judged, which would be like if I said to any one of you here, go tell ISIS that they're going to be judged by God, because Assyria then, and Nineveh then, is very representative of what ISIS is doing these days. They defined barbarism at the time. And what did Jonah do? Well, you probably know the story. He went the other way. And he went, Nineveh would have been east of where he was. He went west. So we have a direction there. We also have a directional in Psalms. So in other words, as these ships would come, a west wind would blow them closer into the Mediterranean, into Israel, but the east wind would break it. So we know it's clearly off to the west. Tarshish was known for their abundant wealth. They were great merchants, and they had seaworthy ships that could stay on the oceans for months, if not years at a time. That's described, the merchants aspect is 7 times in Scripture. The ships, seaworthy ships, 11 times. So we've looked at some biblical, we've looked at some archaeological. Let's look at some geopolitical. This is a latter days prophecy, Ezekiel 38. So what's going on in the latter days with the pivotal moment when Israel was rebirthed as a nation? Well, who's been involved in the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire? Who got involved in helping the Arab states and Israel come into existence? It was not Spain, it was France and it was Britain. Okay? Perhaps Tarshish, as I've got up on the map here. And they helped divvy out those states you see up there, Egypt in 1922, Saudi Arabia, etc. There is no Spain involved in that process technically. Matter of fact, Spain, although it's recovering, it was just a couple years ago that they were on the verge of bankruptcy. So they don't seem to be involved geopolitically there. What about who's been involved in trying to deal with this hostile Arab-Israeli conflict over there? Has Spain been trying to broker peace deals and things like that? No, but America has, if they're the young lions. Jimmy Carter, of course, with Sadat in the Egypt Treaty in 1979. Bill Clinton with in Jordan, the treaty there in 1994. So these are arguments that lead me to favor all these various reasons that we could very well be in Ezekiel 38, verse 13, as the young lions of the merchants of Tarshish, which is troubling, because it doesn't picture us as a superpower country there, but merely as protesters on the sidelines, watching this formidable offense come against Israel, who's supposed to be our friend. I get into this quite a bit on my product out there, America and the Coming Mideast Wars, and in that DVD, that those wars would be Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38, what is our role? It's a DVD. Our role was to be established by God, was to be a safe haven for the Jewish people. That's why there's 5 to 6 million Jews living here. Israel's recently surpassed that with 6 million. France is the nearest, closest other country with a large Jewish population, and many of them are fleeing now from France, with about 483,000 Jews. We're to be a beacon of Christianity to the nations of the world, and throughout the church history, probably no country other than America has done the most to reach out and preach the gospel to the nations of the world. And we were supposed to be And we were instrumental with Harry S. Truman in the rebirth of the nation of Israel. God had specific purposes for us. But my, how things seem to be changing. What's going on with America now? Let's ask ourselves a few questions. And I got this slide from David Reagan, who teaches on this message in some forms as well. Has money become our God? I'm seeing some heads nod. Yes. Has greed become our motivator? Have we kicked God out of our schools? 1962, we took prayer out, adjudicated by the Supreme Court. 1963, we took Bible reading out. Supreme Court ruled on that. Have we legalized abortion? 1973, Roe versus Wade. These are abominations to the Lord. These are dangerous biblical boundaries that you don't want to cross. Now, we've had 55 million abortions, and they're going on at the pace of about 1 million per year. Have we become the moral polluter of the earth? Did the Supreme Court in 2013 strike down DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which was entirely biblical, which said one man should be married to one woman? They could not defend the constitutionality of DOMA. Did they, on June 26th of this year, approve same-sex marriages? The court, the law of the land, did they approve that? These are dangerous biblical boundaries. Sodom and Gomorrah, sexual perversion, destroyed for these types of things in 4000 BC, roughly. Assyria, destroyed in 612 BC for moral decadence and immoral decadence and wickedness. The northern kingdom of Israel, destroyed in 722 BC by Assyria for idolatry, which led to child sacrifice. The next question, have we turned our back on Israel? God will bless those that bless Israel, but he must curse those that curse them. And is God going to uphold his holy name through his people, Israel? Yes, that's the pivotal event we're heading towards that will be here very, very soon. And this deal that Obama thinks is the best deal since sliced bread, this nuclear deal, but Netanyahu says is the worst deal imaginable, and I sincerely believe God favors Netanyahu's view, and he's furious with Iran. The smoke's coming out of his nostrils, and our president is getting in the way of what God's planning on doing. And when a leader of a country or a nation gets in the way, the people go down with that leader. Dr. David Reagan is concerned about this country, our speaker after me here. He wrote in a Lamplighter magazine that featured Jonathan Cahn, who'd been warning about the harbingers and the concerns for this country. I believe the trigger point for our nation occurred in November 2012 when President Obama was reelected. We've ignored the prophets, the remedial judgments, and God has responded by giving us the kind of leaders we deserve. We are now positioned to be delivered from judgment to destruction. Judgment to destruction, the destruction of a nation. He's concerned about that sincerely, and we've talked about that even this trip. He's still concerned about it. Have we been hearing from prophetic voices in addition to Jonathan Cahn, who's warning this country? He's not the only one that's been lifted up. Joe Rosenberg wrote a book about America imploding called Implosion. Dr. Mark Hitchcock wrote a book called The Late Great United States. Terry James wrote a book called The American Apocalypse. These are not sugar and spice and everything nice titles, folks. Implosion, apocalypse. These people are trying to warn, as is Dr. Reagan and myself, that this country is headed for problems. The prophetic voices have been announcing it. They all are concerned that we're now under judgment. What about the remedial judgments? Has the Lord been warning us through remedial judgments? September 11th, 2001. Our hedge of protection came down, many of us would believe, on September 11th, 2001, at which point we've been engaged in 5 different Middle East wars at this point. When you look at Afghanistan, well, 4, Iraq, Libya, and now involved in ISIS. Natural disasters, economic upheavals. We had the worst, costliest disasters in our history in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, followed a month later by another Category 5 Hurricane Rita. We had the worst tornado season in our history in 2011. You might remember the headlines. 3 days, 14 states were ravished with 241 tornadoes throughout this area of the region of the United States, leaving in its aftermath wake and destruction. We had the mortgage meltdown in 2007, the global economic crisis, which stemmed out from America in 2008, the worst BP oil spill, the worst oil spill in our nation's history in 2010, the BP oil spill. And now we've got all kinds of bad things going on in this country where it's not even safe to go anywhere, even to send your first graders into a school. Sandy Hook Elementary shooting where 26 victims, 20 children, 6 adults in Newtown, Connecticut, which up to that point was dubbed as the safest town in America. You've had the Boston Massacre that killed 3. We've got terrorism inside of our shores again. Folks, don't be surprised to see more terrorism on a much more multi-layered and more powerful level come. What about the leaders we deserve? We have a guy in the office who once upon a time in 2008, as a senator, said we are no longer a Christian nation, but also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, a nation of non-believers. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I'm going to try to bash Obama. What I'm about to share with you, he's proud of these accolades. These are crowning achievements that he's got on his resume. Immediately when he comes into office, he repeals Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military. His Attorney General in 2011, Eric Holder, followed up by the Supreme Court in 2013, could not defend the constitutionality of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. And he himself said in May of 2012, same-sex couples should be able to marry, which the Supreme Court has enforced this year. Dr. David Reagan came out recently and said, and I agree, that the death of the nation occurred on June 26 when same-sex marriages were approved. Born in 1776, died as a nation. The writing's on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. We have been weighed in the balance and judged, folks. Can we get a reprieve? Will there be an end of a moment? Many of us are concerned we're too far past that. How could something happen to this country? Possible scenarios. Would there be an economic collapse? That's at the top of my list of concerns. You see what's going on in China right now? I mean, that's just one possible domino that's going to knock down many other things. External nuclear attack. What about an EMP? I told you about those, electromagnetic pulse. You know, on July 4th, 2 Russian nuclear jets flew 40 miles off the coast of California on our Independence Day. And through, I think it was a shortwave radio contact, they basically congratulated America on its Independence Day, flying right by. Iran has been practicing burst altitudes over the Caspian Sea of missiles that could 180 miles above the Caspian Sea. Is it possible? Electromagnetic pulse, which would terribly set back this country. Very real threat. Internal terrorist attacks. Don't be surprised to see some terrorists or a group of terrorists going into major cities like Los Angeles and New York infected with deadly viruses, contaminating and putting a whole city on quarantine, and before the city can respond, it's already too late. These guys don't care what poison they pick to kill themselves. Internal rot, what about the rapture? Would that be something if all the good people, all these wonderful people sitting here and throughout this country and even parts of Europe got lifted out of here? Would that bring judgment upon this country? Some believe that's actually a form of judgment on the country. It's a blessing to us, but it would not bode well for this country. So on my timeline also, in that question mark area, is the rapture. I'm a pre-trib rapture believer. Matter of fact, I'm so pre-trib I don't even buy Post Toasties. But anyway, yeah. I mean, that could happen at any given time. But you know what? We could be here for these prophecies I'm talking about. I don't think we'll be here for Ezekiel 38. I think we'll be here this side of Ezekiel 38. I think we'll be in this gap. And folks, if you've got my message today, this gap is short. Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, the Elam prophecy, the decline of America, the rapture. Are all these things in play right now? Because these are globally impacting, and they will definitely adversely affect America as these things come down. Are you ready for the rapture? Are you rapture ready? Are you doing your daily exercises? Well, whether you're not or not, or if your body's frail, you get a new one in the twinkling of an eye. We shall be saved from the wrath that is to come in Romans 5:9. Jesus will deliver us from the wrath that is to come in 1 Thessalonians 1:10. We are not appointed to this wrath that comes out and judges humanity in the tribulation. We will be kept from the hour of trial that judges the earth. And therefore, brothers and sisters, comfort one another with these words, because Jesus is coming soon, soon, and soon. And in the words of my dear friend, Dr. David Reagan, Maranatha, 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 come quickly, Lord Jesus. Thank you very much.